Lofi Poli Sci and HipsvilleAD coming at you for a special summer music series with our good friend Gregory Day. How we doing out there, Gregory Day?
Oh man, I am doing well. How are you?
Oh man, I love it. I love the summertime as much as I don't like the summertime all the time, but I'm excited about this summer. So what do we have going on? We have a special summer music series. We did this last summer, but we're doing it a little different this time, right?
Yeah. Last year was sort of we did a trade-off thing. With this year, we're going to be doing little mini lists to compare some of our music tastes.
And what list are we doing today?
Yeah, today we're doing our top 5 favorite decades of music.
And I love this. It's like which decades out of all of them were the best for music. And I'm sure we're gonna have some similarities, but we'll probably have some differences too, because music is so personal. But let's talk about real quick how we actually chose our decades. So for me,
Yeah.
what I did is I Googled best artist of the 1940s, best artists of the 1950s, best artists all the way up to the 2000s almost. And I looked at the different decades and the different awesome artists that were in each. And then I compared and thought, all right, which one was better, more influential, things like that. And that's how I made my list. But I will say I did not include the 2000s and 2010s because I felt like it's still too recent to really say how influential and awesome those decades were in comparison to some of these really older ones, you know? But how'd you go ahead and make your list? What'd you do?
Yeah, you were a very modern man. I went through my record collection, kind of browsed and
Oh, I love it.
looked at my collection, kind of thought about it, and I kind of went a little different approach. I thought about music that I like, but I also thought about what's important to music that I like. So it's a kind of a dual approach to the decades I picked. So, are they important to the progressiveness of music, and are they the decades that I like? And so that's how I kind of came to that, to how I came to my picks.
I like it. I like that we both
Yeah.
had a little bit of different approaches too. Maybe we will come to some different answers. Right. And so what do you say? We just go back and forth. You go first, year five, my five, year four, and then we just
Yeah,
take it all the way down.
that
All
sounds
right.
great. Yeah.
So what do you have as number five for the fifth best decade for music?
Yeah. But so my number 5 is the 1970s. It's a big decade full of many different things happening, but to me, it's just a decade that kind of bridges a lot of things from modern times and the decades that came before. And so I picked David Bowie to represent this decade because he kind of comes in as this at the beginning of the decade as this mod sort of post Beatles pop singer, and then by the end he's already by the end of the decade he's already into EDM sort of dance pop music, and so he's the perfect encapsulation of kind of moving music from rock music to the electronic music that's coming in the 80s and that's still relevant today. So I had to pick David Bowie to represent this decade.
David Bowie in the 70s. I dig it. I dig it a lot. I wanted a little bit of different, although you kind of spoiled where I went for my number five. I did
All right.
I did the 1960s
Oh,
and
okay.
the Beatles for my pick for
All right.
the band that represents the 60s the most. I think, as
Mhm.
much as I will say it, and I don't care how much flack I catch for it, I don't care for the Beatles. All right. I don't. But I recognize how important they are for
Mhm.
music.
Mhm.
And in the 1960s, I think you're hard pressed to find someone who was more influential. Um, but I mean, so 60s Beatles, and no more need to be said. I mean, so much is said about them already. So
Yeah,
what's
all
your
right.
number four?
Number 4 is the 1980s. I have a big fondness for
Ooh.
music of the 1980s. I really do. Like I love new wave music. I love the funk music that Prince was making. And, I could just rattle
Oh
off
yeah.
Cyndi Lauper, Kate Bush, all these kinds of singers. But for me, at heart, I'm a heavy metal fan, so I got to talk about heavy metal. And the 80s were the biggest time for that. And if the decade is about excess and the conservative backlash, I picked Ozzy Osbourne as my representative of the decade because he had this extravagant life, and this just legendary drug use, but also he was like public enemy number one to the conservative satanic panic crowd. And so I couldn't think of someone better to represent that decade than Mr. Osbourne.
All right, question for you. Quick
Uh-huh.
fire.
Yeah.
Ozzy Osbourne or Black Sabbath? Go.
Ooh, Black Sabbath all the way.
All right. There we go. There we go. All right. So for my number four, I went even further back. I went to the 1950s
Ooh, okay.
because, and I think if you're talking the 50s, you got to talk Frank Sinatra. Now, I
Ooh.
know some people may say another name, but I'm not talking other names. I'm talking
Hmm.
Frank Sinatra. Name another musician, another singer. So, I mean, he was so big in Vegas, so big in movies, so big in music, and for so long. And
Hmm.
he is still regularly covered by so many different artists today. Hey, Frank Sinatra in the 1950s. What more do I need to say?
Yeah, that's just a classic, man. I mean, I may disagree with you later on in this list, but I cannot say I have to say that you and I do share a great love for Frank Sinatra.
You were the one who introduced me to him,
Yeah,
for
oh, hell
sure.
yeah. All right.
All right, where are you going for number three?
Number three, I picked the 1960s. I went in a different approach than what you did for the 60s. I chose Sly and the Family Stone. Even though they
Ooh,
kind of
I
come
don't
in at
even know
the
who this
yeah,
is.
ooh, what? They kind of come in at the end of the decade, but they kind of encapsulate everything about the music, the feeling of the decade, the turmoil. This is a band that's so diverse. It's got men and women and black and white members, and they have a mix of rock and funk music. They played at Woodstock. Um, and so I'm sure you've heard plenty of their songs, like "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself" and "Stand," and just they have a bunch of hits. But they just, to me, they encapsulate that decade. Even though, I guess they're like the summation of the decade for me, as far as how we understand that decade today.
And what's their name?
Sly and the Family Stone.
Do me a favor, text me your favorite song by them,
I will.
and I will check it out. Because no, I've
Hell yeah.
never heard of them. I may have heard the
Ooh,
song, like you said, but
yeah,
name doesn't ring a bell. All right, for
yeah.
my number three, I went a decade later than the 60s. I went to the 70s.
Ooh.
And I went from a different direction than you did.
Hmm.
You went David Bowie, I went Led Zeppelin.
Okay.
I mean, there's so many songs and guitars, solos, and things like that you could put down there, and they were at Woodstock as well. I mean, but Zeppelin, for someone who in my younger years started playing guitar, like the first song you learn how to try to learn how to play at least is Stairway to Heaven. So I mean,
Oh
Led
yeah.
Zeppelin, they revolutionized and they really changed the idea of like the Beatles being UK and had this like kind of aura about them about what UK music was. And it kind of made this stereotype in people in the US's head. But then Led Zeppelin came about and they're like, no, 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 we are not the Beatles. And the UK has a whole lot more than that.
Yeah.
So I like them. I like them a lot. But that's my number three.
Yeah.
Wh-
The
wh-
Levee Breaks. Great song.
Oh goodness,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
All right, where's your number two?
All right, number two is kind of an outlier here because I went a little ways back. I went 100 years back, and I picked the 1920s because the 1920s is the birth of American music. It really is. Like there's a lot of, classical music and some other things that predate this. But I got to talk about the jazz era and
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and no one better for that decade than Louis Armstrong. I mean, listen to those hot fives and hot sevens collections are just dynamite. And he changed music multiple times, but I had to pick this because I do love a lot of that old jazz, and it makes me think of New Orleans, but also I just love the energy behind it and the simplicity behind it, and yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of people who are better than Louis Armstrong, so I had to go with that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I considered it. I just didn't know enough about the 20s to justify putting it on my
Mm-hmm.
list. But that's a damn good pick, my friend.
Yeah.
My number two, now we're going to backtrack a little bit to a decade you previously chose, but with a way different direction than you went, the 1980s.
Oh yeah.
Right? I don't like the 1980s. I'm like well known for this, but there are some
Hmm.
exceptions.
Hmm.
And music is an exception. And I think no one revolutionized music in the 1980s like Michael Jackson did.
Oh yeah.
And especially whenever we thinking about the rise of MTV and videos and music videos and even music shorts on TikTok today, like it all starts in the 1980s and all the dancing
Hmm.
with music starts in the 1980s. And there's no better example of music and dancing than Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal video. Like killer,
Yeah. Yeah.
killer. Um, so yeah, that what more do you need to
Yeah.
say? That's it.
Yeah, I can disagree with you. I mean, for all of the negative things that are out there about Michael Jackson, you can't deny the influence of his music or the quality of his music. Um, from Off the Wall to Beat It and so forth, it's Thriller, all that shit is just amazing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, all right, so where do you go for your number one? I'm so curious about this. Although now I'm kind of starting to feel like I feel where it is, but you could throw me for a loop.
Yeah.
What is your favorite decade for music? Well, first off,
Mhm.
is it your favorite decade, or is it the decade you think is the most important, or is it both?
I think it's the most important, but also on any given day, it could be my favorite. I would probably say between the 80s and the 50s is probably the music I listen to the most. Um, and so I just spoiled it. I said the 50s. So the 50s is my number one choice.
The
um,
1950s,
the
okay.
1950s, because it's the birth of rock and roll. I mean, it just everything changed forever with this decade. And it's, rockabilly, R&B, country music, everything kind of blending together to make this uniquely American music that just changed the globe, and we hear it all the way to today. But the artist I chose to represent this decade may not be the one you're thinking of. I chose Little Richard because Little Richard really is
Ooh,
the king of rock and roll. I mean, this is a
good
black
choice.
queer artist who is just screaming and dancing around on stage and just changed the world. And so I couldn't think of a better artist to represent this decade and to represent my musical taste and just the top of this list. So Little Richard in the 1950s.
I love it. I love it so much. Now I'm kind of ashamed I didn't choose it. Um, yeah,
It's
what
not
a
just good, it's
great
not just great.
pick.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great pick.
Yeah.
All right, so my number one,
Yeah.
I think you probably do know, but it's the 1990s.
Oh, sure.
And the band I chose, I think this could change on any given day, but on
Hmm.
this day, it's Nirvana.
Ooh.
I mean, when you talk about the 1990s,
Hmm.
there's a lot of different ways you can go. But I think few artists from the 1990s made such an impact that you really put them, especially ones that were part of a band. Like that's the thing. Like I'm not just saying Kurt Cobain, right? Because he
Right.
passed away and his words and his music was amazing and stuff like that. But Nirvana, in and of itself, as a band, was amazing.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, you think of like the grunge movement really got kicking in the 90s, punk movement, ska music, hip hop, even country music was jamming. Then the last decade of the millennia was amazing for music of so many different genres. And so like for me, and especially being a child of the 90s, it's like I do have some bias for this decade, without a doubt. But at the same time, damn, it was such a good decade for music. And I think Nirvana is a good representation of that, because I think I know people of all different spectrums of life that get down with some Nirvana.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm also a child of the 90s, and it was ubiquitous back then. And I recently bought the record on vinyl. I did not own it, and I listened to it a few times. And I don't know if I was really, if I really understood Nirvana when I was growing up, because I was so young to kind of understand where the band was coming from and the influences on the band too. Because like I'm not a huge grunge fan really at all, but that the punk influence on Nirvana is so clear, and but it takes it to a whole different level, and no one sounds like Nirvana. Um, and like you said, just not even talking about the pain and the artistry that went through Kurt Cobain, but like the sound of the band doesn't sound like anybody else before or after it, and it really changed everything. And so I couldn't agree more with your pick for this decade.
And even so, I make my students do podcasts, and one of them did a podcast just last month, and their intro music was Nirvana.
Mm,
Like 30 years later, college students are still listening to Nirvana, still wearing Nirvana t-shirts. Like, I
yeah.
mean, it's still here in the zeitgeist. All right, now let's see what we could do. We have our list. All right. So you picked the 1950s for the best decade for music ever, and I picked the 1990s. Let's see if we can have a little bit of a debate on which one we think should actually be number
Ooh.
one. Can we
Hmm.
come to I don't know, an accord on the best decade ever for music?
Ooh.
Hmm. I kind of like your sell of Little Richard, like
Yeah.
a person of color, a person from the LGBTQ plus community doing rock and roll in the 1950s. I mean, that's groundbreaking. People talk about
Mhm.
Elvis Presley and his dancing and moving hips in the 40s and 50s, but this is something different. This is something special.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. That was enough shit on Little Richard, um, to be honest. But
I like how you just
yeah.
bluntly put that out there.
But I mean, like,
Don't
uh,
worry, I don't think any Elvis fans are listening.
but I mean, Yeah, I mean, Little Richard just, I mean, his cultural relevance, he's still around. I mean, without him, we don't have rock and roll. We don't have, I mean, you look at Prince, like Prince is just styled on Little Richard, even though they don't sound anything alike, like the mustache and just the provocative sexual nature of the music that they're playing. But having said all that, the 1950s has a lot of bad music. And so rock and roll and jazz and folk music kind of that decade are really great, but there's a lot of bad novelty songs and a lot of bad ballads and things like that. And so that don't really hold up well. I could probably say the same thing for the 1990s, but I think in the 90s, one thing we haven't talked about, because it's very hard to choose just one artist, let alone a genre to represent a decade. But hip hop in the 90s is revolutionary. You know, it's just as
Amazing.
revolutionary as Little Richard is, right? Or as rock and roll is in the 1950s. And so right now
People
we're
are still wearing
Mhm.
Tupac shirts. They just had a
Mhm.
Tupac series come out on television. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I was trying to
Yeah.
think, other than Little Richard and Frank Sinatra and Elvis in the 50s, who else can I think? But like in the 90s, well, you could just name drop constantly
Mhm.
from all the different genres.
Yeah.
I mean, even and you know, I'm not the biggest country music person,
Yeah.
but like
Mhm.
Reba McEntire, Brooks and Dunn, Garth Brooks, they were all killing it in the 1990s.
Mhm. Mhm.
Punk music, you had NoFX, Rancid. I'm not going to name ska because no one's going to know what any of that is anyway. I was even stretching it
No
with
doubt, no doubt.
oh yeah, no doubt. That's
Yeah,
a good
everyone
one.
knows
That's
that.
a good
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah.
All the grunge
Mhm.
bands were hitting
Mhm.
good. Metal was still
Mhm.
a thing. Metallica
Yeah,
was still kicking it, doing their transitional thing with
yeah.
Enter Sandman and stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
But also like the rise of Snoop Dogg, you know, the
Yeah,
rise of Dr. Dre, of so many different artists,
yeah,
Common,
yeah.
Black Eyed
Mhm.
Peas. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, electronic music, techno, like the birth of EDM, like true EDM. Um, yeah, it's a revolutionary decade. And
But
so
I
kind
don't
of
know if you get
yeah,
there without
the
Little
1950s.
Richie in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
50s.
yeah, yeah. All right, maybe I'll have to stick to my guns to say the 1950s.
I think I come and walk in your direction, sir. I think I have to. As much as I love the 90s, I think
Yeah.
I can bump off the Beatles in the 1960s, which I would
Mhm.
gladly do. I don't mind doing that at all. And put the 1950s as number 5 and
Yeah.
number 1. I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah, you don't get the Beatles without the 1950s, Buddy Holly and a lot of the stuff happening there. So
Oh, for sure, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Well, excellent list, excellent stuff. And listeners, write in. Tell us what your favorite decades for music are and your favorite artists in those decades. And tell us how we were wrong. Because again, music is all so personal. And we're not going to spoil what the next music series episode is going to be, but it's going to be in a month from today. So check us out. And that's HipsvilleAD's and Lofi Poli Sci's top 5 decades of music. Follow HipsvilleAD and Lofi Poli Sci on Instagram, people. It's Pickering and Day. Peace out.
Until we meet again, my friend.